we're not going to finish today. We're going to do as much as we can in a extremely complicated sugya. But I just want to start with ha'ara that Ilum was handling yesterday. Nesinah lechatchila, and lemaisa we found an earth-shattering Shmuel Kamenetsky, as always. No, not about wiping yourself in the toilet. That's the wrong one. 1 second. Yep, that's right. So Shmuel. That happens to be just on a side note. Now that I saw that I had that flagged off, in the world famous machlekes of baby wipes, the earth shattered and changed when Rav Shmuel came out with this sefer over here of Daniel Usher, and he explains Rav Shmuel's sheet on baby wipes, and he explains a very very famous Ramesha. Stam, it's another marmakum. But just to start about putting something Nesinah lechatchila. So we were handling yesterday. Okay, I'll get the memo through the grapevine about Nesinah lechatchila on an overturned pan without a blech. We were make we quoted Rishon Zalman that quoted a chacham echad that can make an overturned pan on top of blech. Lemaisa, Rav Shmuel comes along over here in Parak Chaf Vav Islam Medalid, and he says Mutter lotzal b'kederes cham b'shavas tavshin zvachim erev Shabbos kol kigun pandish. Lefi in derech bishel. V'lav davka de kederes chamen. Tu adim mutter lanichal de keder rekonis ha'oimid al ha'ish. There it is. V'amut lahami keder rekonis lagabe ish b'shabes b'shol lanichal tavshel al gabo. Keder rekonis al ha'ish is fine. It says dav keder rekonis shel toich v'chalal. But if it's a stam a baking tin, then he wants to say no. At the bottom of here it says Rishon Zalman maybe was makel on the baking tin, but Shmuel held that's a chiddush gadol. And sounds like he's makel. Just I don't fully understand because in the footnote over here, when he goes through the whole Torah, he says everyone's machmir. Then he says, look at the Shmir Shabbos and the Shevet Levi, that they want to be makel on a kedera rikanis al gabi ablech. They answer up to stira that it's only machmir if it's al gabe, if it's not gufa ktuma. But if it's gufa ktuma, then he can be makel. And therefore, if you put kedera rikanis on a blech, everyone holds its mutter. And that's like the end of his marmakum. But he's talking about kedera rikanis without the group of iktuma. So I don't really know where he explains that's okay, but he says it. So that's ha'ara number 1. Okay, with that, let's dive into kli shlishi, coffee and tea. Kli shlishi, coffee and tea. That's going to be a little bit of the agenda. As always, we have to point out that we didn't finish the sugya, as always. As much as you said, what do you mean? We did Dalet, we did Hey, we did Vav, we did Zayin. How much more do you want to do? So the problem is you didn't do Yirches. And Yirches is where Rafal builds his entire hallmark tshuva about coffee off of Sif Yirches. So that's really part of the problem here. So we're just going to speak it out, but get there, setting up the sugya. Because Sif Yirches talks about Samim Manim, dies. And by us, we have something called Tavlinim. And the big shayla is, what is the chilik between Samimanim and Tavlinim? Because Tavlinim were makel and a klisheni, Samimanim were machmir forever. So, which is part of the whole Agasa story. So Rafal comes along and he says, what is this chilik? And that's going to tell us the story with coffee. Now, with coffee, there's many iterations of coffee. There's the Mr. Brewer's coffee and tea. There's our Heintig instant coffee and tea. And then there's the Naya instant coffee and tea, which has the percentages not ground, which is what Rafal's entire tshuva is to come to say, not, what did I say? Yeah, it makes no sense. Thank you. Not cooked, which we're going to hopefully talk about the whole process of here. Great. And mechatesi coffee would be in tavlinim. Great. So that's the shayla. Great. Okay, good. So that's the shayla. Good. Before we can't ask mechatesi. We'll get there. Maybe your Moshe says like you. We'll get there. let's get there slowly. But before we get there, we have to fix a mistake. I have to fix a mistake that I made last time. Last time I said that the tzad of chumrah of pouring the water directly on the coffee, I said it's because there's a noilat and a moilid shayla. Now, in words, we didn't really explain it, but to explain it a little better, it's because the Mishtabura says that a davar yavish that turns directly into alach has a din of alach. That's really the way to say the tzad chumrah, and therefore maybe in as much as coffee is a davar yavish, but when the liquid goes directly onto it and it becomes alach, it might have a din of a davar lach, and therefore you're going to have a problem being makel in a kli rishon or a irui kli rishon, and that is the reason why we're going to have to go into a kli sheni even for regular instant coffee. That's fixing what we spoke about last time. So now, what is lamais the process of coffee? So, I mean, I think we all know what they do. They roast the beans, then they grind the beans, they cook the beans, and they suck out the no, they sift out the grounds, right? If you don't sift out the grounds, you can have a problem. And then they dehydrate the water. Okay, is everyone? Again, you roast the beans, then you cook the beans, right? That's called a pour over coffee, or that's called a brewing the coffee. You brew it, and then you got to get rid of the grounds. And then the way to make freeze dried or whatever it is, you suck out the liquid, and you're left with instant coffee. Do you all agree with the Matthias? Yes. Okay. Now, just whether it's relevant or not, I'm not exactly sure. Rafal wants to point out that you're not actually eating the coffee itself. Instant coffee is not a bean of coffee that's ground up. That's a total mistake. Instant coffee is the bean that was ground, it was cooked, it was sifted out, you took out the bean, you sucked out the liquid, and what you're eating is you're rehydrating something that was hydrated. That's what you're doing. Correct. Correct. Meaning so you're never actually touching the actual coffee. All it is the time that came out of the coffee, you're recreating into a liquid. You sift out something. No, what you sift out was the bean. It's like you make a new brew of coffee. What do? You got the basket at the end with the grounds. So the basket at the end with the grounds goes in the garbage. The coffee, that is what they take and get rid of the water. And that is your instant coffee. Yes. 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 Now, when they do that, yes, just very, very, very strong. They just get rid of the liquid. That is instant coffee. Good. Now, this is where is Nisayr a Shiloh. Because when they suck out the liquid, how do they do it? They pour the liquid, your cup of coffee. They pour it through insane heat, something like 200 Celsius, 800 Fahrenheit, about 270 Celsius. So, which basically instantaneously sucks out all moisture. And then it falls down, and the bottom, it's only 110 Celsius. That's 110 Celsius, which is also pretty hot. Shows pretty hot. Okay. Okay, 580, 590, if those who can do math. Wonderful. Now, what's the Shaila now? The Shaila now is, so you did Sliya. Good. You did Bishel. Good. You did Agav, a sifting process, just to make sure we know what's going on. And now, when you dehydrate it, is that called an afia process? That's really where a lot of the shaylas come from. Or what should it be called? Oh, good. So it's for sure called an afia process. No, or sliya afia. Good. And if it's called sliya afia, bonagid, I'll tell you in a minute, because you better believe it's an alternative, or else everything's also. Bonagid is called sliya afia. So now, this was as you dry it, when you go through that intense heat and it sucks out the liquid, that's called afia or tzliya. Again, so you have tzliya, bishul, sliafia. Now, Celsius. Don't worry about the bottom one. They're again, it's a lot of science going on. 110 is still very, very hot. Yeah, it's still very, very hot on the bottom. What does it make a difference? He wants to make a difference. Don't worry about that. We're getting very, very lost. Let's try to keep what's clear and what's confusing because there's a lot of things confusing and we didn't get to the confusing part yet. I know. Yeah, I try to get there. So that third step, okay, Sliya, Bishul, Sliyafiyah. This third step, if what we just said is true, if you now put it in water, you're doing Bishul, Achar Tzliya, which is awesome. So how in the world can you go, and even in a klisheni, we're machmir, and therefore, l'chayra, this is one of the reasons why maybe you have to make your coffee, all coffee, even regular instant taster's choice, then maybe people will say, oh, you can even make it in a kli rishon because it's cooked already. No, maybe mamish fakert. Maybe you have to make it in a kli shlishi. Because it was the last process done to it was sliya. And now, so. We are machmir, but it is a machlokes. But we'll give another reason. Before that's not the greatest reason. Meaning, that's a reason why it wouldn't be b'diavad fine, but lechatchila we are machmir that sliya after bishul that we were machmir on that. But the answer is, and this goes back to last year. The answer is, says Ramosha, says all the Gedolei HaPoskim, that third step is not called sliya and afiyah. Why not? Let's go back to our friend the Chazon Ish. Can't say that. Our friend the Chazon Ish from last week. Why? Is there a tam of tzliya and afiyah going into your coffee? Avadanat. And therefore, they all want to say that it does not negate the prior step of Bishul. And therefore, it's still at that step that it was cooked. And therefore, now to recook it, you're still within the regular rules of Ein Bishul Achar Bishul with a Davar Yavish. And therefore, you could do it in a cliche without a problem. Elamai, it's going to go and it's going to, on contact, become a davar that the Mishabura says to be machmer for. Okay, so then you have different shitas. I think Rafal and Ramesh also says that it's not true. It doesn't immediately happen. What happens is the water goes in, and then then you see the pieces, and then it melts. So that's not called directly lach. That's not what the Mishabura is talking about, and therefore you can be making even a klisheni. If you want to be machmer for that, then what are you going to have to do? Then you'll stir it in or you'll put it on the wall, but then that's a separate issue. That is stam, regular, instant coffee. Do you have any questions? It's a real siyavia, but because it doesn't give tam, we go back to our regular rule that if it doesn't give time, it's not called sliya nafiyah, and therefore it's still called bishul, and therefore everything is good to go. It's the previous step of bishul. The previous, exactly. Here, I'll read you the words in Rafalk. Upashit, this is in Chelek Gimel, Siman Lamed, required reading. It's a long reading. It's a very, very long reading. Hamzi pretty easy, although I got stuck on the Hebrew, so I'm saying it's easy that I get stuck. But the first part is hard. You can't every Davis to tell you the science, but the rest of it is pretty easy. So he says, and then that was part of the reason why he wants to say he starts at 270, goes down to 110 to maybe negate the whole shayla. But Lamais, he says, Pasha in Chavetz Tzivul L'Sai Kach, Machat Avei Bari V'Shema, you have a Mekilim. And then he says, V'Noisif L'Zeh, meaning, first of all, he says, as some of you pointed out, that there are Mekilim in on this step of Bishlach or Tzliya. And now, furthermore, he says, "V'neisel had lebar klal da kofe ne'efal l'bseif. D'itachin shachoim ene moisif tam lekofe klal k'mosh legabi sukar mekabli ba'ilam loy lachshish liyivush hagam shu mamish k'moizeh shal kofi machmas the poshish in yivush hasukar mishanes taimoi." And so too by the coffee v'chein hayre ha'igreis Moshe as well as the Rosh Hashanah v'chulu. Okay, so that is regular instant coffee. Are we all perfectly clear? Good. Now, this is where the problem comes in. The problem comes in when we want to talk about tea. And when you want to talk about tea is when we're also going to want to talk about all these new types of coffee. And the problem is the machlekes, Mishnah Brura and Ramesha will call it, or maybe we could call it Chazon Ish and Ramesha if you want, which is what is the status of Kali Abishal and a Kli Shlishi? The Ramesha is Mekel Chazin, is Machmir. And what is the status of tea? Is tea Vade Kali Abishal or not? On that step is how do we figure out what is this thing called Vade Kali Abishal? How does it work? So Ramesha, we'll start with Ramesha. So we all know the Mishnah Berurah comes along. The Mishnah Berurah gives his whole arichas over here, and he's very, very scared, and he doesn't want even to do an Shishi, and therefore he says to prepare a sense, and even on the sense you should be careful. Which probably that's also a mitzvah of fire same, because people know to make sense, but they end up messing up. Why? Because they make sense. How do they make sense? They take a pot and they put in a bunch of tea bags and they pour water on it. Say irui kli rishon onto the tea bags. Great, and they sit there in the water. Wonderful. Come Shabbos, what do? They take the sense, pour it into a cup, empty cup, and then they put the cup under the urn and do iri kli rishon directly again onto that cold sense. That is a problem. That is us. That is us. That's yish bishal acha bishal b'davar alach causes cold. That is us. Why do they do that? Why don't you just be normal and take the water, put in a cup? Now your cup is a cliche. You know, pour the sense into it. The reason they don't do that is because they want to be machmir for tzviya. Tzviya. Whether the tzviya b'eichlin is a big shayla, we pass in ein tzviya b'eichlin. Although we pass in ein tzviya b'eichlin, we're machmir to do it in the reversed order. So people know that. So they go and they put the water in, and then they pour because they want to be machmir, they put the sense in an empty cup. Maybe I'm talking about a Meiser Shaya of myself. And then they go and they put the water underneath and they pour the boiling hot water in, and then they're over Nisr Bishel. So Tzviya is a Chumrah, that's a Mermekalon. This is an straight up Isser. So don't do that. So what should you do if you want to get Alashitas? Is you can do is what? Right, good. You put the water in the klisheni, you put the sense into the cup, and you pour from the klisheni into the sense, and everything is perfectly fine. But that just sometimes you get confused, and be careful. Now, granted, this Mishnah Berurah about the tzviya is right over here is our Mishnah Berurah, and it's an important marmakum because in the world of tzviya, when we'll learn tzviya one day, it's not as explicit over there. Over here, it's much more explicit. To flip it around. Okay, now. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, and this is really where I mean, the way that my feeble mind sees the sugya is that you have a clear clash, and the way Rav Moshe is approaching the sugya versus, we'll say, the way, let's say, Rafalk is approaching the sugya, in one detail, which really is, as I started, how do we compute Tavlinim versus Samimanim? This is really how Rafalk sets it up, but Rav Moshe says the exact opposite. So to me, I'm just sitting here with a headache. Let me read you Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe comes along. Rav Moshe is in Daled Ayin Daled very famously. He says you can make tea in a kli shlishi. He says the minhag is to be mekel, even yanech by. In another place he says loy near a klal. What's the other place? That's in Beis Tesvav. Loy near a klal. Take a dvar and shadash b'kli shlishi. Loy Nesinah b'kli shin. He says the Aruch HaShulchan, which this is one of those rayas, right? Or Davis is one of those rayas that he gave more credence to Aruch HaShulchan because he quotes Aruch HaShulchan's chumrah over here, not the Mishnah Berurah's chumrah over here. Okay, Yesh Ladin. This didn't make the Aruch HaShulchan share. Oh, good. Okay. So you don't even need a raya. That's pashut. That's pashut. Umashikasav Aruch HaShulchan she'einenu rois. Zokt Aruch HaShulchan. Einenu rois she'tei mitzvashel gam b'kli shlishi. That's an Aruch HaShulchan. Einenu rois. Now, what does einenu rois? Means our eyes see. The Aruch HaShulchan said, I don't understand what's going on over here. He sees Rav Moshe making a cup of tea in a kli shlishi. Says Aruch HaShulchan, it's in a clear cup, right? So he says, I don't understand. You have your water in a kli shlishi, you drop the tea back in, and I see the tea being made. That's Aruch HaShulchan. Says Rav Moshe, long move on. You see the water getting colored? Why? What's his raya? Listen to his raya. This exact raya, Rafal is going to use exactly fakir the other way. Ta'af b'mayim korim mamish mitadmin b'meshech zman. Cold brew tea. Leave a tea bag in a cup for, what is it, 8 to 12 minutes. Let it steep in cold water. And it's also going to get colored. So, Zakra Moshe, that's not a raya at all. The Koshkin b'chamin shein yatzledes v'lo zu inyan bishul el bishul inyan acher to toyeles Va'amdu Chazal shu dafka b'choim gadol ma'oid. At shalachu davka give us a dura. Chenu balite shema shenitzva hamayim b'choim katon einoi inyan bishul. B'mkein I don't know. Me'atzmin klom elam mikabel. It's like Ramesha. Aruch HaShulchan can't make things up. U'melu kol stam devarim du b'klisheni safek v'lishlishi yesh lahater ad kan devarim. What's the marmakum for Ramesha? It's a Pri Megadim. Pri Megadim comes along and he says you're allowed to put kali bishul in a klishlishi, and it's not a problem. Okay, there's a Ksesa Shulchan that says the same thing. Ksesa Shulchan that says the same thing. Remember, Shember says the same thing. Nishur Shabbos says the same thing of Harpenis. V'chul. Lamaisa, we all know the Chazon Ish, Rav Yashiv, Shlem Zalman, Rav Nevinsal. They were all very, very machmir. They said Yesh V'Zechiv Skila was their lush. But that Raya of Ramosha, again, we have this clear cup of Kli Shlishi water that we drop a tea bag in and we watch the tea being made. Zoktar Chashochan and Nenura, he says Bishul. Zakra Moshe, absolutely not. So Rafal, in his hallmark tshuva, he comes along and he says, what is the Shaila? The Shaila is, we have our sif of Tavlinim, which is mutter and a klisheni. And then we have a sif later off in sif Yurches that comes along, and there's something called Samimanim. And in Sif Yurches it says, Elfos Vakatir Shavir Mutacham Magabi Arim, Lan Izvasha Kotakin Bitim Makaviam, Shisa Migas Vikabir, Ben Izvasha Kotakin, Avol Tsemer Liyoira, Afal Pisha Kolata Ayin, Osir Lahagis Boy. Semer Liyoira, the dye, it's always Osir. You can't shake it. Says the Ramal, fine. Why is it Osir B'chol Inyan Semer Liyoira? Is because dye is an entity that keeps on cooking. It's a shartzin over here. Dye is an entity that keeps on cooking. Says, Rafal quotes this, Mishnah Bura. This is Mechaber, excuse me. What's Pshan the Mechaber? There's three different reasons the Rishonim. Comes on the shartzin Kuf Lamed Ches. Kuf Lamed Ches says the shartzin. Why is it also lahagis? So the Mishnah Bura says Mishum Seveya. Shkenu melechas hatzviya lahagis tamid. Should keep on mixing it. Kadesh lo yischarich. Gama yidei agos and niklat atzeva b'tsemer yeser. Keeps on getting more dye. Says the Shartzion. So Tamaran ve'vi reilas of Yishalmi. V'tamasheni tamarash b'tir sheni. V'yishayiv tamarash. Good. V'samimanim srichim bishul la'olam. They always need it. They always could be cooked. V'nafgemina. And mavashel samanim b'mayim v'loy tzemer. The shnei trutim ha'koidmim. There's three truths in the Rishonim. The first two, it's mutter ba'agasa. Uletam zed, it's mishbura's paskening. Aser kain kasva pri megad. So says Rafal, what do you see over here? You see that anything which is efsher lahaflit oid seva is going to be nichlal in bishul la'olam. So now you have to ask yourself a question. We have tseva, dyes, which is bishul oilim. We have tavlinim, which is mutter b'klisheni. So says Rafal asks the kash on himself, and he says, "What's the chilik between tavlinim and samimanim?" He says, "Hagam." He asks a kasha. Hagam that a tavlin we know is mutter b'klisheni. He says, near the kviyas chazal, tavlin kashem bishul, v'loyit bishul b'klisheni. Kam kiviyah shaloyim tavlinim bishul b'klisheni. Uma, listen to these words, tell me if they sound familiar. Uma sheroyim plita. You see the plita, you see the color, you see the extract. He kemoya plita sheyesh b'nesinas tavlinim b'mayim karim. Keina plita zois. Natuach dargo hu b'tavlin. Hanitanim b'klisheni. Asheinu doime klal plita sheyesh kishan doisim tavlin. So he wants to say that that's going to be the defining factor, whether it's going to be seva or whether it's going to be tavlinim. That if it keeps on coming out more and more and more and more, then it's going to be like seva. And that's why tea and that's why uncooked coffee is going to be like seva. And it's going to be something you could cook and cook and cook and cook. And rice. Or I see that what? It keeps on coming out. Keeps it coming out. So I just have a problem that Rafalk and Ramosha are saying the exact same thing in opposite rayas, which really is an Aruch HaShulchan. right? What's Aruch HaShulchan doing? Ramosha, how's Ramosha taking on the Aruch HaShulchan? Aruch HaShulchan said in Erois that it comes out, says Ramosha, in Erois it comes out, it's just color. So the Ramosha is arguing the Aruch HaShulchan and what? Aruch HaShulchan watched that cup of tea brew. Aruch HaShulchan said Aser. Ramosha says to Aruch HaShulchan, oh, it's not Aser, just color. So Ramosha is taking directly on the Aruch HaShulchan. Aruch HaShulchan is talking about this case. Correct, of course. Again, go back. Aruch HaShulchan says you have a tea, and he sees the tea brewing. It's Aser b'kli shlishi. Ramosha says to that exact video of the Aruch HaShulchan saying Aser, mutter. Why? He says it's not called cooking. So what's the fight? The fight is, do we view that which is coming out? Is that called bishul or not? What's the marmakim zakrafalk? I'll tell you the marmakim. The marmakim is samimanim. There's a three-way machlokes in samimanim, and the second shita in the Rishonim tells us that which keeps on coming out and out is an isser of bishul, and it can be tavshil, shabishul, viter, and that's what tea is. Tea on the third cup. Good. So that's what Ramosha says. So we have a clash in worlds. You have the Aruch HaShulchan, you have the Mishnah Brura, Shartzian L'chaira maybe, you have Rafalk. They're all watching this cup of tea, and they're all saying in a cliche, you see something comes out, oh, it's awesome. Then you have Ramosha who's watching and saying, no, I'll give you a rye, go put it in cold water, it's also going to come out. That's how they're defining Bishul. I mean, you're arguing around right now. That's how the Ran explains it.
Bishul, that since there's color coming out.
Correct. That means it's continuously cooking it. That's what Shartzian says. Shartzian says straight up. Says utam zeh aser. That's exactly what he said.
If you put like a raw vegetable in you put a.
Oh, very good. So there's other Gemara in Shabbos talks about that you take a cooked piece of animal and you put it in water, you get soup. So there's a krafalk over there. That's not called the plita coming out. That's called. There's two separate usages for the item. I don't know. This is very difficult. Again. I'm not arguing with you. I'm just giving you the shitas over here, and that's my headache right now. Is that you have an Aruch HaShulchan, you have Ramosha who are clearly arguing on the exact same mitzias, and then you have Rafal who's weighing in like the Aruch HaShulchan, and I just don't know. The rayos are the same rayos both ways, right? If you put in a kli shlishi, ravi, chamishi, what happens? Eventually, it gets less. So is that a raya gets less? Is that a raya gets more? I don't really know. Yeah. Yeah.
It dies, right?
Yeah.
It continuously comes out. That's what the
eventually it stops, right?
Does it?
Of course, everything eventually stops.
Good.
So I don't know. That's a three-way.
Saying it never
It doesn't say never stops. It says there is more and more bishul to be had. It doesn't. Nothing never stops. Nothing never stops. Everything stops eventually. It just means that. Again, I don't really know, but to me, just the problem is we're using the exact same prabha, the exact same litmus test on both sides of the coin, and what do we do with it? Now, just to end, I'll just end with a Chassam Sefer, and then we need to talk about this more. The Chassam Sefer says that when you cook the coffee, it's edible, and that's the reason why there's no more bishul afterwards. That's a Chassam Sefer, Ginas V'ratim. That's Rafalk's other raya that doesn't apply nowadays, because our coffee that you cook is not edible, and if a miyut to demute of people, he says you eat it with chocolate, maybe doesn't make it edible. That's another raya that Rafalk wants to say that the roasted beans, are not called edible, and therefore if you cook them afterwards, it's going to be a problem. Now, Ramosha, what?
They're still not edible.
Correct, but it's still a bishul that's happening, getting it into the water. Correct. Ramosha addresses this. It's not that Ramosha doesn't address this. Ramosha addresses this exact point, and he doesn't care. He says coffee is like a taflin, and therefore it doesn't cook in a klisheni. And lekalis tafuke shu mikali abishal, and he's not bothered. Ramosha is not bothered by the whole shmooze. So I don't really know. We're going to stop over here. Hopefully we have a little bit of clarity and a little bit of confusion. And I don't know. We'll go weiter, Mirza Shem.